Now we want to talk about the case that the economy experienced a positive supply shock. When we say the economy experienced a permanent positive supply shock, it means that the positive productivity increase impact not only on the current income, but also the future income. In addition to that, it also affects the marginal product of the capital at this period and the marginal product of the capital in the future. Also, it impacts on the current wages, also the future wages. That is because the shock is permanent. It not only affects the current period, but also affects the future period. Therefore, when the productivity increase is permanent, the marginal product of the capital will increase, not only current, but future, because if we assume the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is y is equal ak theta L to the power of 1 minus theta, the marginal product of the capital need to be equal the dy dk, which equals theta a k theta L to the power of 1 minus theta and k to the power of theta minus 1. So then when there is a positive supply shock, it means that this term in here, the A, not only increased this period, but also in the future periods. Therefore, the marginal product of capital at current period and also the future period increase. The same thing for the wages. We know that when the firm maximizes the profit, it's going to choose the marginal product of labor equal to the real wages. In here, we are not emphasizing the real wages concept, so we use W in here. And again, the marginal product of labor need to be equal the dy over dl. And then it will equal 1 minus theta ak to the power of theta L to the power of minus theta. Again, when the productivity increases permanently, it means that it increases forever. So the marginal product of labor not only increase at current period, but also increase in the future period. So then now what we want to do next is that we want to examine how does such a shock affect the ISLM equilibrium. So to begin with, we want to look at the labor market. So from the perspective of the labor market, we know that the increase in the productivity will both affect the demand and the supply of the labor. So let's start with the demand side. From the demand side, we know when there is a productivity increases, we know the marginal product of labor increases. When the marginal product of labor increases at current period, it will shift the labor demand curve to the right, because labor demand curve increases given the same wages, which is under the assumption that when the A increases, holding all the other things being equal, the labor demand increase, which implies that in the labor supply and demand diagram, we know that the labor demand curve will shift to the right. That's about the labor demand. So let's look at the labor supply. When the A increases, the labor supply causes the real wages. In here, I can just write the wages, or you can think about it as the real wages that increases. And then when the wage increase, does it mean that the labor supply will shift? It turned out that the quantity of labor supply increase. However, it is about moving along the labor supply curve, because the increase in the labor supply is because there is a price changes. When the price changes and the labor supply increase, it will not shift the labor supply curve. How about the increase in the future productivity? Well, when the future productivity increases, it means that at the end, the future wages should increase, because the firms are willing to pay higher wages because the productivity increase. And then when this increase, there is an increase in the future wages, people would like to work less nowadays because they know they can take a rest today and then they work more tomorrow. Therefore, it will causes the labor supply curve to shift to the left. In other words, if we look at the diagram of the labor market equilibrium, the vertical axis is about the real wages. The horizontal axis is about the labor supply and the labor demand. We know that the labor supply curve is shifting upward and the labor demand curve is shifting downward. And then we know the joint effect of the permanent productivity increase will causes the labor supply curve to shift to the left and the labor demand curve shifts to the right. So then let's look at how does it imply about the labor market equilibrium. Well, it turned out that when the shifting to the left of the labor supply curve is similar to the degree of shift of the labor demand curve, the first case can be that the effect cancel out and then it will be causing no changes in the quantity of labor demanded and the labor supplied. Let's look at the graph. Let me change the shifting of the labor supply curve a bit, and then I will be able to cross at the point where in fact the equilibrium quantity of labor are exactly the same as before due to the shifts. So this case tells us that it's possible that the shifting effect somehow got cancelled out, so the equilibrium quantity will somehow stays the same. And then what is known for sure is that the real wages should increase. That's about the first case. How about the second case? Well, for the second case, that if the labor demand shifts is greater than the labor supply, then it implies that let's redraw the shift of the labor supply only slightly. Then that the economy will end up to have higher wages for sure, similar to the first case, but then the L will increase. If that is the case, then it will causes the full employment line to shift to the right. Similarly, there can be another case. That is, if the labor demand curve, the shifts, is less than labor supply curve shifts. What will end up is that let me redraw the graph. Then we are going to end up have the labor supply curve that shifts a lot, way much more to the left. Then it end up to have the equilibrium point where the quantity of labor that is clearing the market somehow falls and the real wages still increases. In this case, it will cause the full employment line to shift to the left. So we know that when there is a permanent positive supply shock, the full employment line can go all the ways. It can stay at the position where it was, it can shift to the right, and it can shift to the left. It can be either way depending on how big is the shift of the labor supply curve and the labor demand curve. Now let's look at how does a permanent positive supply shock affects the goods market equilibrium. Again, let's start with looking at the demand of the goods market, which is about the investment. So what we know is that when there is a permanent positive supply shock, the current productivity increase and also the future productivity increase. When the current productivity increase, it makes the marginal product current of capital to increase. And when there is an increase in the future productivity, it makes the future marginal product of the capital to increase. What we know is that when there is an increase in the current marginal product of the capital, it will not causes the increase in the investment. That is because the investment is always made at current period and for future use. Therefore, if the shock only causes current increase in the marginal product of the capital, the investment will not increase. How about when there is a positive permanent productivity shock on the future marginal product of the capital? When the future marginal product of the capital increases, we know that if we invest more today, there will be more capital for use tomorrow, and then we are going to get more next period. Therefore, we know that under this case, the investment need to increase. So for this case, again, it is given the same R, which is the clearing price of the goods market. The investment increase, which implies that the investment curve need to shift to the right. So that is about the demand for the goods market. How about for the supply of the goods market? Well, the supply of the goods market is how much the household want to save. So let's look at the impact of the current productivity increase and future productivity increase on the household saving decisions. So when the current productivity increase, it causes the current income to increase. Then what happens is that people want to smooth the consumption based on what we learned about the consumption saving decisions that we learned last semester. Based on the Fisher model, we know that when the current income increases, it will causes the saving to increase because we want to save some part of our increase of the income for tomorrow's use. Given this case, again, it's given the same R, it will causes the saving curve to shift to the right. It is again given an R. So how about when there is an increase in the future income? When there is an increase in the future income, it will causes the saving to fall, because people know that they are going to get more in the future. So in order to smooth the consumption that due to the increase of future income, today we will also willing to spend more because now we know we have more lifetime resources. Because of that, this effect will causes the saving curve to shift to the left. So what we know is that from this perspective, that somehow that the shift of the saving curve is ambiguous. However, now we want to determine how does this result affects the IS curve. It turns out that when the demand side of the decision that shifts the investment curve to the right, the economy will end up to have a higher R in equilibrium. In that case, it will shift the IS curve to the right. How about the result based on the saving decisions? It turned out that even though in what direction the saving got changed, end up to have different direction of shift for the saving curve. But what we know is that when there is an increase in the current income, which causes a savings given a R, in that case, such a shock will not shift the IS curve, because that is how the IS curve is determined. Because when we determine the IS curve, we explore the case that when the current income increase, how does it affect the savings? We know that the savings should increase, and then it resulted in a lower R in equilibrium. Therefore, we come up with the IS curve relationship, that there exists a negative relationship between R and Y. So now we know when the Y increases, even though the saving curve shifts, there is no shifting associated with such an impact for the IS curve. However, when there is an increase in the future productivity, the future income increases, which causes the saving to fall. For that case, it is also given an R. Therefore, we can come up the result that the saving curve shifts to the left. But when the saving curve shifts to the left, the economy will end up to result in a higher R. In that case, it will causes a right shift of the IS curve. Therefore, combining all the results, we know that the demand side tells us that the IS curve shifts to the right. The supply side tells us that one effect causes the saving to increase, but the other effect causes the saving to decrease. It seems that the shifting of the saving is ambiguous, but we know for sure that the IS curve need to shift to the right, because one effect from the current productivity increase causes no shift in the IS curve. But when the productivity in the future got increased, it shifts the IS curve to the right. Given that the demand side also tells us that it will shift the IS curve to the right. Therefore, in conclusion, we know for sure that the IS curve needs to shift to the right. So that's about the goods market equilibrium. Now let's look at how does money market responds to such a shock. So again, we want to look at the demand side. Given that the productivity increase is permanent, it increases the current income. What we learned earlier this semester is that when the current income increases, it will cause the real money demand to increase. However, this increase will not shift the LM curve because that is how we derive the LM curve. How about on the supply side? Since the money supply is controlled by the central bank, therefore we know that when there is a productivity increase, holding all the other things being equal, nominal money supply remains the same. Given that at the earlier stage or in the short run, the price doesn't change because we assume that the price is sticky under the Keynesian view for the short run. Therefore, we say that the real money supply will stay at this stage, especially in the short run. So then what we end up to know is that combining the supply side and demand side of the money market, we know that in the short run, the LM curve will stay at what it was after the shock. How about in the long run? Well, it depends on where the full employment line shifts. So for example, we know in the ISLM equilibrium with the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. We know that the LM curve is sloping upward and the IS curve slopes downward. Before the shock, the economy attains its general equilibrium. Therefore, full employment line will cross the intersection of the IS curve and LM curve. So that is before the shock occurred. However, in the short run, we know that the IS curve will shift to the right and LM curve will stay. Therefore, in the short run, we only need to focus on the IS curve and LM curve. For the IS curve, it shifts to the right and the LM curve stays. Therefore, in the short run, the IS curve shifts to the right and then it will cross the LM curve at this point in here. In other words, we know that in the short run, the economy will turn out to have the R that increases and the Y increases. How about in the long run? In the long run, we are focusing on the intersection of the full employment line and the IS curve because we know eventually the LM curve needs to shift such that it will cross the intersection of the full employment line and IS curve. So then because the shifting of the full employment line somehow is ambiguous, therefore we need to discuss it based on three cases. The first case is that the full employment line stays. The second case is that the full employment line shifts to the right. And the third case is that the full employment line shifts to the left. And then we will be able to identify how does the general equilibrium changes in the long run. So then now let's begin with the discussion. So for the first case, the full employment line stays. If the full employment line stays, and the IS curve shifts to the right, we know that at the end, the economy are going to have a higher R and the same Y. However, to restore the general equilibrium, LM curve needs to shift to the left such that it crosses the intersection of the full employment line and the IS curve. So the general equilibrium tells us that the LM curve needs to shift to the left. When the LM curve shifts to the left, if we recall what we learned before, the price needs to increase such that the LM curve will be able to shift to the left. Now let's look at the second case, that the full employment line shifts to the right. If the full employment shifts to the right and it turns out that the shift is small and then it crosses to the left of the new intersection of the IS and LM curve, that is this point in here, then we know that the LM curve still need to shift to the left such that it will be able to cross the intersection of the full employment line and the IS curve, which implies the price need to increase if the full employment line shifts only a little bit. On the other hand, if the full employment line somehow shifts quite a lot to the right of the intersection of the new IS and LM curve, that is the second one. The new intersection is here. Therefore, the LM curve needs to shift to the right to restore the general equilibrium. In here, it implies that the price needs to fall here if the full employment line shifts a lot. And here, the a bit and a lot is depending on whether it is to the right of the intersection of the IS curve and LM curve or to the left of the IS curve and LM curve. Now let's look at the third case. The third case is that the full employment line shifts to the left. If the full employment line shifts to the left, then we know that the general equilibrium will be at the point where it is to the left of the short-run IS and LM equilibrium. In that case, the LM curve needs to shift to the left, which implies that the price needs to increase. So in other words, in here, in most cases, LM curve need to shift to the left, which is implying that the price need to increase to restore the general equilibrium. However, if under the case that the full employment line shift to the right and shift quite a lot, such that the new general equilibrium point is to the right of the short-run equilibrium, then the LM curve needs to shift to the right to restore the general equilibrium. In that case, the price needs to fall, and then the economic implication of the permanent productivity shock will then be different. So to wrap up what we have talked about for this case, that the economy experienced a permanent positive supply shock, we know that for the labor market, somehow the full employment level can be either increase, decrease, or stay the same. Therefore, the full employment line can shift to the right, to the left, or stay the same. Then we look at the goods market equilibrium. It turned out that when we aggregated up all the impacts, it will imply that the IS curve needs to shift to the right for sure. Finally, for the money market, we know that in the short run, the LM curve needs to stay when there is a permanent positive supply shock. However, in the long run, because the full employment line shifts, so that the price needs to adjust such that the economy can restore the general equilibrium in the long run. So then depending on how does the full employment line shifts, when it shifts a little bit to the right or shifts to the left or it stays, then for all the cases, it implies that the LM curve needs to shift to the left to restore the general equilibrium. In that case, when there is a permanent positive supply shock, the price needs to increase. However, there is one scenario, that is when the full employment in fact increase quite a lot, then the full employment output will increase quite a lot, which is exceeding the level that's determined by the short-run equilibrium. In that case, the price needs to fall, which then associate with a right shift of the LM curve. So then, in conclusion, when there is a permanent productivity shock, real wages need to increase, because even though the full employment level can be increased or decreased, however, both of them resulted in a higher real wages. But then based on how does the degree of shift for the labor demand curve and labor supply curve, there will be three outcomes for the full employment level. The first outcome is that the full employment level stays. The second outcome is the full employment level increases. The third outcome is that the full employment level can decrease, because different change of the full employment level will result in different level of the full employment output. In general, we will assume that the labor demand curve will shift more than the labor supply curve. Therefore, for the general case, we will assume that the full employment line shifts to the right. We will end up to have a clear result that the output should increase. And then because consumption will proportional to the output, therefore the consumption also increase. However, how does the R change is ambiguous, and it depends on how does the saving curve change in the saving investment diagram. But one thing also remain unknown is about how does the price change, because we know that even though we know the full employment line shifts to the right, it is possible that the LM curve will need to shift to the left or shift to the right depending on the degree of the shift of the full employment line. Therefore, under the discussion in here, we find out that even we are sure that when there is a permanent productivity increase, it will increase the full employment level. Even we make this assumption, the changes of the R remain ambiguous and the changes in the price remain ambiguous. So here we complete the discussion related to there is a permanent positive supply shock. How does it affect the ISLM equilibrium in the short run and in the long run?